Suhail. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? I have a tendency to wander around, so I'll try and keep my voice loud enough I don't need the microphone. So, just to introduce briefly, if you go to this URL here, you'll find my slides. I'll show this URL again as I talk, but I find this is a useful way to keep track of what I'm doing, but also to allow you guys to kind of have it on your screens if you want, take it home, look at the notes later. My slides have got lots of extra material that I'm probably not going to cover, at least I hope. There's going to be way more words on the screen than I have the energy to read out, but you can go back and look at these later and browse through them. And as I say, this URL, you'll see it a couple of times. Okay. So to start, my title, which I plucked out of thin air when I was still not sure what I was going to talk about, to be honest, was something that, it was something that this man said, Elon Musk. We're trying to have the non-weird future get here as fast as possible. Now, I'm just going to leave it hanging for now, and I'm going to come back to this, but you are going to see a lot more white men today, a lot of white men. And this is perhaps part of what I'm talking about in some way. There's lots of things that I'm not going to unpack today. There's lots of conversations to be had here. I offer this up as a sort of essay in the process of being written, and hopefully we can discuss some of the things that are missing out of here. But I'm also kind of having a conversation with myself. There's 2 or 3 different projects in here that I'm trying to bring together in conversation. Okay. So part 1, sometime around 2015. So first I'm going to go back to 2013 and cheat. And this was the year that Edward Snowden's revelations were released. And we all know the kind of outcome of this. Lots of echoes that are still passing through the political sphere, especially related to big data, surveillance, and these companies that Suhail has talked about, the companies such as Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Apple, who have built their power out of our data, more or less. This is one way to put them under the same remit. What's interesting about Edward Snowden's revelations, as they were called, and this specific piece of software called Prism, which was available to the NSA. And it's worth mentioning that NSA don't have access to all of our data at the touch of a button, much like the film on Edward Snowden made it look like. They could just type your name and then they could see your, everything about your life. But they, through US law, were able to request that information from these companies. And Prism was part of the infrastructure that allowed them to do that. But what's at play really in this is a kind of focus that we have on data in this contemporary era, and an idea that, that more data is somehow better, somehow truer, for both sides of the coin. For the NSA, if they have access to all of our data, they can keep us safe, they can protect us, they can protect the state or so forth, just by gathering this data together in aggregate. Somehow some truth will emerge and we'll all be safer, okay? But also the response to this, the response by you, the public, by the media, that we somehow felt as if our privacy had been invaded. We each personally felt part of this larger aggregate. And so there's something to be said here about the value that we place on data today, the value that we place on it as part of our identities, and how this is playing into these larger questions, okay? Now, I'm going back to 2015 when I gave a paper at Theorizing the Web conference in New York. And it's interesting for me to go back to this because so much has changed in the time since 2015. And to see the differences is partly what I'm here today to do. At the time, I was fascinated by this company that I'd read an article about called Narrative Science. And I'm very glad that they've changed their logo here, because it's quite extraordinary. Let me see if I can... if you go to the website now, you have this wonderful woman made of data who smiles at you across the divide. How the future gets written. And they say now human science, narrative science, is humanizing data like never before, with technology that interprets your data, then transforms it into insightful, natural language narratives at unprecedented speed and scale. Turn your data into actionable, powerful assets that you can use to make better decisions, improve interactions with customers, and empower your employees. So narrative science is essentially a company that sells their algorithms to various companies to turn cold, hard data into human-readable patterns. And this can happen at various different levels. They write algorithmically generated news articles out of statistics and data, such as the movements of stocks and shares on the market. But they also do small things. The one I was fascinated with was Little League score tables in the US. There's a huge database kept of Little League scores so that parents can keep track of how their little cute ones are doing. And narrative science takes these scores and turns them into human-readable miniature narratives where the patterns of the game are turned into a little tiny story so they can hear how Jimmy did in the Little League game. But I was very interested in the bombacity with which this company sold its story, the idea of narrative and data coming together. And this is the chief scientist, Chris Hammond from Narrative Science. He says, these narratives generated by systems that understand data, that give information to support the decisions we need to make about tomorrow. So very kind of futuristic idea that our futures are bound to our data, and we need to humanize this using their language. Okay, I've lost my layout here. So I wrote a paper about big data and narrative, essentially. How are we to deal with this overwhelming amount of information, and are we doing this correctly? And this was all tied into other questions such as the algorithms that run things like your Facebook feeds or your Twitter feeds. At the time, there was lots of discussions about social media bubbles, about being caught in feedback loops and only seeing what was palatable to us arriving in our Facebook feeds. And to understand this, I went back to Jean-François Lyotard's definition of postmodernity and all of its huge influence that it's had over kind of critical thought, at least in the West, over the last generation or two. That Jean-François Lyotard, in his book on postmodernity, actually thinks about the influence of what he calls, and I'm going to forget my terms here, trying to do two things at once. Where's my thing? I need my notes. Okay. I think he calls it, I haven't got the terms here, he calls it technoscience and informatics, something like this. This is his terminology in the 1970s when he was writing this. He says, it is only in the context of the grand narratives of legitimation, the life of the spirit, and or the emancipation of humanity, that the partial replacement of teachers by machines may seem inadequate or even intolerable. But it is probable that these narratives are already no longer the principal driving force behind the interest in acquiring knowledge. Essentially, he talks about a turn away from the grand narrative, that at some point, these turns towards the spirit, these religious grand narratives or narratives given to us by the state or charismatic leaders may have made giving all of our education over to machines and our children seem ridiculous, seem inadequate or intolerable. But today something has changed. Narratives have broken up. They've shattered into pieces. It's not what drives us anymore. And what's more, he says that as long as we understand informatics, as long as we engage in these technologies, we will be able to drive our children's education through this kind of understanding. Now today, of course, we kind of see there's a sort of naivety to this. The fact that we could understand these machines and therefore our children's education is at hand, that we have full control over our children's education through understanding. We today are ensconced in this incredibly complicated world of technologies that maybe Lyotard could not have foreseen, and there is a grand sense that we've lost track of these tools, that the tools are overpowering us. To understand them on a technical level is not enough to control them, and those who do control them, well, those narratives can still be seen to be grand. They are not as fragmented as maybe we'd like to think, okay? I was interested in how we could turn these ideas round and ask something that Lyotard asked, which is, how do we kind of reaffirm the grand narrative again? We, instead of clicking on Facebook links because they adhere to our idea of ourselves, instead of taking part in this huge techno-capitalist mechanism, maybe we should start to alter the algorithms and work in harmony perhaps with these groups like Facebook, Twitter, to have the algorithm show us a grand narrative, to have us enter into this. And my example of this was environmentalism, was a lot of the conversations coming out of the Anthropocene, but it could be anything. We as a society decide that the most important conversation that we should be having at the moment is to do with the environment. And so we give Facebook the opportunity to tweak and change their algorithms to show us stories which would engage with this grand narrative of saving the environment. There is another naivety here, and we're kind of entering into totalitarian areas, controlling narratives and so forth. But this was my proposal in 2015. So of course, a lot has changed since then, but we're still kind of dealing with the fallout of these conversations, especially around groups, corporations such as Facebook. At a couple of months after my talk, Facebook scientists who work within the Facebook Corporation released a study that they'd done, essentially to alleviate people's worries about the bubble, algorithmic bubbles that were bubbling up on Facebook. Okay, the paper suggests that users, the people who navigate these Facebook feeds, are actually much more influential on the kind of things that you're going to see than Facebook's algorithms are. And this is a theorist, Nathan Jurgensen, again based in New York, and he went through this paper, did an analysis, 2015. So this is directly from the paper. The power to expose oneself to perspectives from the other side in social media lies first and foremost with individuals, okay? First and foremost with you. And Nathan Jurgensen relates this to the claim that guns don't kill people, people kill people, okay? It's the same fallacy that we see come up again and again, especially perhaps in relation to technology, that technologies are somehow neutral, that Facebook does not have an enormous responsibility in maintaining these tools in a politically transparent way. In some sense, this paper gives up the responsibility back to the users completely. We are the ones that create these feedback loops in our social media feed. So Facebook's researchers try and minimize their role in these mechanisms. Okay. I've got to say the reason this picture's up here is because I searched for the word technology, and this picture came up, so I just put this on here. So, I have no idea why, but yeah, technology, David Beckham. Around the same time, there's this great essay by Wendy Chun, which you should all look up and read, and it's on the links on the VLE. Wendy Chun wants to remind us of a kind of two-part situation that's going on in these systems. That agency is often applied to one or two or specific parts of the system. So we think that the users have agency. We think that the programmers of Facebook have agency, the people who actually write these algorithms. Maybe we think that the people who run the corporation are the agents in the system. They are the ones responsible for what we see on our feeds. But Wendy Chun wants to remind us that agency happens across all of these things. In a sense, how technology functions, how programmers work, their biases, their politics, the kind of situations that they're ensconced in, all have a part to play in this, and so do the users. We are ensconced in this complex web, and our agency is not our own in some senses. It's part of a relationship we have with these different sections. Okay. Another thing that happened in 2015, which is now, it feels like ancient history, BuzzFeed, has disappeared in many senses, but I think its influence is still embedded very intimately in how social media functions, especially how Facebook functions. And the guy who founded BuzzFeed, Jonah Peretti, is a very interesting character who came from the art world in New York, and some of the early stuff that went into the production of BuzzFeed was actually produced by Jonah Peretti in artist residencies that he took up in New York. It's very interesting to trace this lineage. If you don't remember, BuzzFeed was that site that had outrageous clickbait titles, and for a long time it really began to monopolize the Facebook feed, and other sites started to copy it, and the kind of BuzzFeed model became very, very successful, to the point where Facebook tweaked their algorithms in around 2016-17 to effectively remove these links from the feeds. Now it's very rare that you'll ever see a BuzzFeed link appear in your feed. But these are the kind of things that they do. It was all listicles. 35 things white people need to stop ruining in 2018. 25 things you won't believe happen next. These things that made you click through, that gave you this kind of sense of engagement, this clicking kind of dopamine hit buzz. And the founder, Jonah Peretti, he had written a paper when he was, it's about 20 years earlier, in 1996. I think this is his BA dissertation. And he wrote a paper called Capitalism and Schizophrenia, Contemporary Visual Culture and the Acceleration of Identity, Formation and Dissolution. Now, in this article by Dylan Matthews goes back and reads this paper from 1996 and finds many things in it that he believes BuzzFeed is founded on. And let me try and unpack this a little bit. So he's using the ideas of Deleuze and Guattari, and he's using the ideas of, who else have we got? Frederick Jameson, positing the figure of the schizophrenic. This is not the schizophrenic in the medical sense of the terminology, but it's someone whose identity is kind of dissolved, who doesn't have a stable identity. This is how they use it, albeit problematically. And in the paper, Dylan Matthews claims that in contemporary capital, in the bubbling up of many different visual cultures online, there is a kind of answer to a problem that Deleuze, Guattari, and Frederick Jameson saw in the emerging hyper-visual cultures of the 1980s in things such as MTV and kind of cable television and the first kind of 24-hour news cycle. So let me read something for you here. So Deleuze, Guattari, and Jameson use the figure of the schizophrenic to refer to an individual without a defined ego or identity. Jameson saw the rapid-fire succession of signifiers and MTV-style media of the 1980s as serving to confuse viewers, harming their ability to use culture to build identities. So what Peretti says is that no, we today have a slightly different mechanism that we can encourage the production of many, many identities on a daily basis, and we can encourage users to generate new ones on a whim. And he says in his paper, capitalism needs schizophrenia, but it also needs egos. The contradiction is resolved through the acceleration of the temporal rhythm of late capitalist visual culture. This type of acceleration encourages weak egos that are as easily formed and fade away just as easily. And so there's no direct evidence that these ideas went into the founding of BuzzFeed. But the author of the article, Dylan Matthews, pasted his questions to Jonah Peretti on Twitter and said, did your 1996 paper have any influence on your ideas about BuzzFeed? And this is Jonah Peretti's answer. And this is our first stepping into the social media space directly. Jonah Peretti said, I share my view, but the intentionality of the subject should not be privileged. Hashtag 1990s, hashtag undergrad. Okay? Very evasive, very strange tweet. Okay? The intentionality of the subject should not be privileged. Now, we can read many things into this. I would read into it that Jonah Peretti is kind of making fun of BA graduate education, right? He's making fun of reading things like Roland Barthes and defining his entire kind of capitalist enterprise on the readings that he did as a BA student. But this evasiveness and this double edge of mode of answering is kind of the next thing that I want to talk about now. And I hope that this lineage starts to kind of build us through social media history, but we're going to go forward now. So, part 2, to equivocate. Okay. Now, this is where I'm going to pack some stuff in, and forgive me here. I'm not going to be able to go through all of this information, and I'm going to make grand generalizations, but I hope that there's stuff here that you can follow up yourselves later, and I really encourage you to do that. So, last year I was lucky enough to go and do a summer school in Montreal. Part of this summer school, and with various different parts, we were thinking about the history of extraction, the history of colonialism, the history of globalism coming out of the city of Montreal, and thinking about how these things related to the idea of a planetary future in a kind of fictional sense, perhaps, but also in a critical political sense. And we were lucky enough to go and have a talk from a historian who was from the First Nations people that were around the city of Montreal long before the Westerners came and called it this name and claimed it as a city. And I'm going to get this completely wrong, but they were the Kanawake people of this region. Okay, and we had a talk from this guy about the seaway in Montreal and its impact on the history of the community and it is as a kind of like rethinking the colonial settlement of this region. And he gave a really fantastic example of what I'm interested in, which is equivocation. Equivocation, this is the term. So this is how equivocation plays out at a colonial level. So the people of the Kanawake, I'm going to keep saying that very carefully, they had their lives and livelihoods part of the waterways around this region for many, many centuries, for many generations, going way back. And when the Western settlers arrived, they saw the seaways, the waterways, as a great way to bring materials, bring capital, bring control into the city, to build the new city that they wanted to build around these bold waterways, to partly humanize them, to incorporate them into the infrastructure of the city. And they went to the Kanawake people and they said, would you mind moving from this area because we're going to build here? And the Kanawake people said no. And then they went back and they said, we will give you this land here, we'll give you money, we'll give you whatever you want. And the Kanawake people talked and they said, no, we're not moving. And now this is what happened. The Westerners went away, came back a little bit later, and instead of talking to the whole group, they went to individual in the Kanawake people and they said, would you like some land? You have a family, you want to have something to give to them in the future, a livelihood. We can give you your own land to call your own in the area you live. And many people said, yes, I would like this. And so the city folk gave these people forms and formalities that offered them this land legally. And after many of the people in the Kanawake had these legal rights to the land, then the city people came back and they began to buy out each of these rights one by one. And they bought out individuals within the Kanawake people. They basically conquered and divided the group, and the kind of family order that had existed started to fall apart, tensions between people, fighting over what was legal and what was not, who owned what, and they essentially managed to move the Kanawake people in the way that they wanted to move them. So this is a very common story in the history of colonialism, right? We could come up with 1,000 other stories. But I think this is a really great example of how, and this is the words of Linda Tuahe Smith talking about decolonization, that how the principle upon which imperialism, colonialism is founded is that of code, is that of a shared grammar, a shared set of laws. And the city folk came in and offered the people of Kanawake something of their own order, something that they could call themselves within the principles of the city, within the principles of the outside. But then they used this promise of order to create disorder within the Kanawake people. Now this is what we can call equivocation, okay? And this is from another theorist, Homi Bhabha. From the Latin equivocare, to be called by the same name. To equivocate is to use language ambiguously to conceal a truth or to avoid commitment to a single meaning. So the promise of order is delivered actually in order to instill disorder. Okay? The promise of order here is the mode of speech, and the outcome is actually one of absolute disorder. Okay? So Homi Bhabha writes that the two sites of disposal between the colonized and the colonizer, the colonized and the colonizer, the frame of reference and a mental inclination that is governed via an act of equivocation. The frame of reference and a mental inclination. The frame of reference being the rules of the city, the rules of law, and the mental inclination being one of power and control. One of law rules everything. One of we must follow the rules of the land. Okay? Does this kind of make sense? I'm covering vast swathes of post-colonial discourse here. But this term equivocation is key for me. And I would go back and say that this is our first example that Jonah Peretti carries out what we might consider to be our first kind of social media equivocation here. I'd share my views, but the intentionality of the subject should not be privileged, okay? I would share my views, but the intentionality of the subject is irrelevant here. But he's already sharing his views. He's already telling us this. We have this two-part structure going on, a strange twisting of words playing out, okay? Now, I'm going to unpack a couple more of these. Okay. let me jump ahead a little bit. So part 3, the definition of what it means to be reasonable. My students will have already had quotes from this guy earlier today. This is John J. Quirk, and he's writing about the history of the idea of the future in 2009. And he is talking here about how many kind of ways in which the future as a concept has traveled and traversed Western thinking can be seen again and again and again, and they emerge again and again and again over time, okay? And he's talking specifically here about what he calls modern computer enthusiasts. We can bundle in under here these large corporations, these data aggregates. We can also bundle sometimes ourselves into this, living in a data society, living in society of vast swathes of information, of hyper-connected technologies. We find ourselves ensconced in the language and logic of the computer enthusiast, of the technocrat. So modern computer enthusiasts may be willing to share their data with anybody, but what they're not willing to relinquish as readily is the entire technocratic worldview that determines what qualifies as an acceptable or valuable fact. What they monopolize is not the body of data itself, but the approved, certified, sanctioned, official mode of thought, indeed, the definition of what it means to be reasonable. And this is possible because of a persistent confusion between information and knowledge. Okay, so let me unpack this a little bit. So what he's saying here, basically, is that these modern technocrats often mistake data, information, as fact. And what we actually need to understand, what qualifies as knowledge, is a much more complex understanding of the social and infrastructural and economic and historical conditions that go into a system of thought, what might be considered to kind of be our paradigm of thinking, okay? There is a persistent confusion between information and knowledge. Okay. One second. Okay, I'm glad that people recognize data. This is my image for big data, okay? Now, this condition of knowledge today, if we are returning back to these kind of principles of data, we have this term big data, and it underpins a lot of the conversations. Facebook is not just a social media platform that we use to share doggy photos, or that we are influenced by Russian hackers and showing us information that might influence our vote or so forth. It's also a massive array of information that's been collected by these corporations. And that information can be sold, that information can be used to make decisions, and governments and corporations alike are doing this at the moment, hiving that data, okay? This is an article from 2008 in Wired magazine, and as often is the case with Wired, there's a very strong sense about how rich and wonderful the future is going to be. And Chris Anderson is here writing about big data, and he calls the article "The End of Theory. The data deluge makes the scientific method obsolete." And in this he claims that today we've got so much information flowing at our fingertips that we're entering a kind of new ontological condition where we can trust we can trust the data so readily because it comes from so many different sources, it comes to us so instantaneously, touch a button, etc. Who knows why people do what they do? The point is that they do it, and we can track and measure it with unprecedented fidelity. With enough data, the numbers speak for themselves. The idea of an incredible sea of kind of truth that's flowing over us. And let me jump ahead here. Okay. So part 4, and this is my the point again where I'm kind of returning to social media. Post-truth. So, the kind of poster boy of the post-truth movement, and I'm not going to spend much time unpacking post-truth, is of course Donald Trump. The way in which he seems to flaunt traditional notions of truth values, of knowledge acquisition, in kind of a pursuit of the narrative, of the story, and of Donald Trump's story, the story that he wants to tell. There are much more insane examples, but the one that up here about global warming is very fundamental to a lot of the policy choices that are being made now in the US, and a lot of the ways in which Donald Trump is deconstructing the state in America. The concept of global warming was created for and by the Chinese to make the US manufacturing non-competitive. Okay, very simple, right? William Davies in 2016 said that we're in the middle of a transition from a society of facts to a society of data. And during this interim, confusion abounds surrounding the exact status of knowledge and numbers in public life, exacerbating the sense that truth itself is being abandoned. Donald Trump is directly fighting with this at the very moment. This was happening a couple of weeks ago, where Donald Trump, he'd obviously been sat in the White House and gone and Googled his name on Google, and then tweeted very angrily about the result. Now, we could spend a long time, asking the question of whether Donald Trump really understands how Google works. I don't think he does. He doesn't understand the algorithmic complexity. He doesn't understand the agency is involved in its users, is involved in media outlets, is involved in the programmers, is involved in many different aspects, okay? And so he returns to this very simplistic narrative that Google have something against him, yeah? A very, very simple turn against the sea of big data, yeah? So Google's done a very, very good job of managing our information, managing the web, of making it navigatable, making it intelligible, of us able to even understand or find things that we want to find. And we are all at some level ensconced in that mechanism in a way that Donald Trump is completely removing here. And we don't even need to read this out. Google search results for Trump news shows only the viewing reporting of fake news media, rigged, bad, fake CNN, Republican, conservative, and fair media is out. Illegal, 96% of results on Trump news are from national left-wing media, very dangerous. Google and others are suppressing voices of conservatives and hiding information, and news that is good. They are controlling what we can and cannot see. This is a very serious situation and will be addressed. Okay. And this has been addressed. If I jump ahead, I'm going to jump a little bit. This has been addressed in a very short space of time. People were called up in front of Congress to answer the questions of whether they are biased, of how they are going to be more transparent, of how they're going to deal with the kind of claims that Donald Trump is making, that they are somehow in control of the news. This is Jack Dorsey, who we'll have more of in a minute, but he is the CEO of Twitter. If any of you have been following the news around Me Too movement, been following news around the banning of accounts on the site from strange right-wing pundits such as InfoWars, all the way through to activists who position themselves on the left, whose shouts and arguments in the Twitter feeds of many people have seen their accounts banned and shut down. When we have the hatred of someone like Donald Trump, first and foremost, right there on the Twitter site, it's unquestioned, and yet the voices of activists and individuals are being silenced by Twitter, then perhaps we should be asking Jack Dorsey about their principles. And so here, I think we find another equivocation from Jack Dorsey. And inside this, we have everything that we need to understand this kind of supposed neutrality within which the tech world functions. The same kind of neutrality that we see levied on all sorts of technologies that we can roll back through time. But it's a neutrality that we see again and again in relation to tech. So Jack Dorsey says, Twitter does not use political ideology to make decisions. Okay, this is in his testimony to Congress. We believe strongly in being impartial, and we strive to enforce our rules impartially. In fact, from a simple business perspective, and to serve the public conversation, Twitter is incentivized to keep all voices on the platform. Now, what he's done here is another equivocation in a sense. He's saying, of course we are impartial because business is the founding principle of what we do, and we want to make money, and therefore by implicit argument, that must mean that the market is unbiased, right? That must mean that these technologies are somehow unbiased. That must mean that the algorithms that power them are unbiased, that the people that write the algorithms are unbiased. The argument being, it's our incentive to be neutral because that's how we make our money. End of conversation. But there's a certain strange twisting going on here in this argument. Okay, and I did jump, and I'm sorry. So I want to, and this is my one kind of addition to the conversation here, and I'm breaking this down perhaps unfairly into two camps of different kinds of truth value, different kinds of fact value, different kinds of what different definition of what facts are constituted by. I'm going to call it dataism. Dataism, and it's actually a term that you see banded around a little bit at the moment. What's the book? Homo Deus, the sequel to Sapiens. What's the writer? Does anyone know that? Harari. So in Homo Deus, which is a book supposedly about our post-human future, Harari rebels against dataism, the belief in data being all things, that somehow the future is about this neutral, perfect, amazing thing called data. All answers will arise from this, and he rebels against it. And we can perhaps say that for the dataist, intelligibility and truth are founded on whether something is computational, whether something can be computed, and the fidelity of that computational claim. And fidelity means essentially how much information you have. So the more data we have, and the greater our ability to compute it, the closer we can get to something resembling truth, yeah, in the eyes of the dataist. But this meets at the same time that we have this other version of truth lingering on the edge of our consciousnesses and influencing our media outlets and our leaders and our rhetoric, which is post-truthism, which we're much more familiar with. And this is not my theory, but built on the ideas of a social scientist, Walter Fisher, and if you follow this link, you can find more about that. But he says that perhaps, and this is writing in the 80s, but it applies to this, that there is a fairness value, a truth value in narrative coherence, in whether something is plausible, just in its coherence as a narrative, okay? So we have this incredible sea of data that's impossible for us to understand, but computational, and therefore accessible. And we have this almost a response to the vast sea of data, which is that if we only have a coherent narrative, then that is also a way to access truth. Trump is always about coherent narratives. The conversation, why did Google show mainly liberal news sources when I type my name in? We'd have to have a long conversation with him about how Google works, about who uses it, about the kind of ways which the news outlets enter into a kind of monopoly with Google to get their links higher up in the search, about how link backs work, about all of these complicated things to give him the answer. But in Donald Trump's answer, the answer is very simple. It has a narrative coherence. Google is biased and it's against me. Yeah? Very simple. Two different kind of worlds colliding together in this space. And so now, to kind of wrap up and to go off on some tangents, I offer all this stuff as a kind of starting point for considering these spaces, for looking at the kind of people that frequent them, and in Suhail's structure for the talks, in this kind of strange antagonistic space that's emerged, and the kind of figures that seem to benefit from that. A lot of these figures recently that have benefited from this space happen to be white dudes with enormous amounts of money, who are generally based in Silicon Valley, have some investment in these technologies, and in the kind of truth that these technologies embody in data, in the neutrality of these technologies. Yeah? Has anybody followed the many social media furores around Elon Musk in recent weeks, recent months? Yeah? We all saw him and his girlfriend Grimes being taken down on social media by Azealia Banks, and the kind of outburst about this. We also saw Elon Musk enter into this incredibly strange kind of black hole of self-fulfilling nonsense when he claimed that a guy who was helping to save the children that were stuck in caves in the Philippines was a pedophile. Yeah, did we see this? Donald Trump made a submarine which he took to the Philippines to help them save the boys through these tunnels.
Elon Musk, not Trump.
Elon Musk, not Trump. Did I say Trump? Trump does not make submarines. I don't think so. But he probably does have one now, right? And this was a very good piece of self-promotion on behalf of Elon Musk. You know, there's his vision of there's all these weird and wacky ways to solve problems that nobody thinks of except me. Here I am with my submarine. And the people who actually trained to go in these very dangerous caves and bring the boys through, they said, and one of them prominently said on the news, this thing's not going to work. It's nonsense. It's just all a PR stunt. And then Elon Musk called this guy a pedophile on Twitter. And then he doubled down when someone said, you have no proof of this. Elon Musk said, well, he hasn't sued me yet, so therefore it must be true. He's definitely a pedophile. It was a very strange situation, okay? Now I put this up here because this is also a convergence of things. Elon Musk went on a right-wing pundit podcast by a guy called Joe Rogan, and had a long rambling conversation about various things, which ended up with Elon Musk smoking a joint live on the feed. This is in California, so apparently it's legal. But Elon Musk has been given security access within California because he is building grand infrastructural projects. And apparently if you have security access to certain things, then you are legally not allowed to smoke weed. Right? So by smoking weed on there, he broke his security profile. All of this stuff plays into stocks and shares rising and falling around the company. But I was interested in Jack's response to listening to the podcast. Our friend Jack, the CEO of Twitter. And the kind of grand, emptiness of the way that Jack listened to the podcast and what he got from it. Listen to these statements that Jack has picked out from the podcast. So he says, this is an honest and fun conversation between Elon Musk and Joe Rogan. Stop at the headlines and memes, and you'll miss all the thoughtfulness, clarity, and curiosity. And these are the things that he picked out as clear, thoughtful, and curious. These are what Elon Musk says. My goal is to do useful things, maximize the probability that the future is good and make the future exciting. Okay? And then he said here, I think Tesla is the most fun thing you could possibly ever buy. It's not a car, it's a thing to maximize enjoyment. Okay? Now these are throwaway comments, but hidden within them, there are, again, a set of equivocal statements taking place here. Yeah? It's not a car, it's a thing to maximize your enjoyment. How much is kind of lost there in the complexities of what Elon Musk is doing, in the privileges that are forgotten in terms of what it is to own a Tesla car, in terms of what it is to be able to enjoy the things that he enjoys. And so I moved to where I got my title from. All of this social media outbursts from Elon Musk means that his investors get worried, concerned. And he has online conference calls with them. This is one from 2016, in which he is announcing the merger of Tesla with SolarCity. This is basically the merger of two parts of the Tesla electronic empire, which is the cars that run on solar power and the company that is investing in solar and rolling solar out across the country of America. Okay, these incredibly bold statements again say a lot about the mentality of a white guy like Elon Musk and the kind of tech mentality that he's engaged in. So he says in one conference call, and hear this as a Trumpism, I think. This sounds to me like something Donald Trump would say. I'm highly confident we'll be the world's best manufacturer by a margin people don't even think is possible. Yeah? Very grand statement. Talking about solar power. This is what the world needs. This is the Earth's solution. Again, another equivocation. This is what the world needs. This is the Earth's solution. And lastly, we're trying to have the non-weird future get here as fast as possible. Now this is the biggest equivocal statement, because the definition of what weird is held in stasis here. Yeah? What is weird? What is the non-weird future? If you're talking to investors, then the non-weird future must be things that are not fossil fuels, things that are related to solar power. I also like to think that maybe there's another meaning in here. In anthropology, weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. I don't think that this is what Donald Trump is saying, although it would make much more sense if he was. We're trying to have the non-weird future get here as fast as possible, the non-Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic world get here as fast as possible. I don't think that's what he means. Okay. And I'm going to tie this up now. We've already gone from Jack Dorsey. I'm not going to talk about Jordan Peterson, although I could. Maybe I'm not going to even talk about Richard Dawkins, although I could. Or Sam Harris, another white, Western, privileged person whose social media voice has been kind of echoed in this echo chamber over recent months and years. So as I said, I was never leading towards a grand thesis, a grand synthesis of these things. I wanted to hang them over and have a conversation and see where they took us, okay? The conversation kind of led through from this origin of social media, this origin of what is expected of it, what we expect of it, and some of the kind of failures that have happened, some of the collapses that have taken place over the last 2 or 3 years to bring us into the point where we are now, these complex conversations about how these spaces function and how to inhabit them, okay? And I did want to linger on data, not just as a kind of founding principle of our contemporary technocratic infrastructures and social structures, but data as somehow embodying something about how truth value is considered today. I'm jumping around. The idea that data represents some kind of new intelligible space, that only if we have access to a sea of information and we can compute that information can we gain access to the truth. For me, this collides very strongly with the post-truth era, okay? With an idea that we only need a coherent narrative to understand something, to gain something valuable out of it. And as we, the public, and the public out there who are not in this lecture theatre, are ensconced in both of these conversations, we look for truth online, we look for it through Google, we use these massive data aggregating systems to take part in our own narrative coherencing when we want to establish whether something has a truth value or what knowledge is or what it can be considered true. We turn to these systems more and more, okay? So I'm going to leave it there. I'm not going to talk about my project or, that Shuhal mentioned at the beginning, but please do go and have a look at some of my work and follow some of this stuff up. Hopefully we can tease this out a little bit in the questions. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask one question just to give like an overview of what I understood you to be putting forward. I've got a second question, which I'll leave to a later point. So as I understand it, you're interested in equivocation, which you took from postcolonial theory to be the avoidance of a commitment to a single meaning. Right? You're interested in that is it's a way to give, to articulate the sort of politics or the effects of technological neutrality. So the CEOs and the rich white guys are essentially the people who are kind of promoting the technology for commercial reasons because they believe in it, they think it's a solution. And if you don't know, Evgeny Morozov's stuff on solutionism, which is also a critique of Silicon Valley along these lines, it's worth looking at that. So they're saying technology is neutral. And for them, equivocation is a way in which they can take a position in the public space through Twitter and Facebook and appearances in the media that kind of matches that technological neutrality. So there's a sense in which equivocation ends up supporting power. Right?
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that they're intentionally equivocating. I mean, sometimes maybe there are intentional equivocations. I don't think that that's what's happening here. What I think is that these technologies, considered in their neutrality, and the way in which these discourses, and some of which leak onto social media, and actually perpetuate what you're talking about, this kind of, I think that they do work in this antagonistic space. They do kind of feed into that. That there is an imperializing act that's happening in this positioning. And we can go back to many times in the history of people in power, whether it's their power is ensconced in technology or other things, and find that the conditions of that power are ensconced in the mode of speech, in the mode of display, in the mode of discourse, and that's where the equivocation plays out. It has an imperializing tendency.
Right. So the equivocation of not taking a position ends up supporting, kind of, in one case, colonizing forces.
Yeah.
In this case, kind of corporate colonization of communications, and so on and so forth, which is kind of very different to the standard notion of power, which is like the powerful actor. You know, if you think of like Trump's hate speech, because it's around a lot, or people all over the place, or history, the totalitarian leader kind of puts forward a very clear and strong statement of identity, and taking a side or taking a position, and then we kind of backtrack from that and say, like, we need to be more careful, and so on. So you kind of, I think what's really interesting is, like, equivocation stops being against power and starts being kind of a power tool, a tool for power. But the question I wanted to ask you was, how is technology not neutral?
How is technology not neutral?
Yeah, because your criticism sort of, you can criticize the discourses, but also implicit is that technology is not in fact neutral in the way these people are claiming. So if you could just, I think it would be useful to understand that from your side.
I mean, again, we could be talking about any number of things, but technology in its general sense is not neutral because people made it. People are not neutral. It's not neutral because it functions within economic, infrastructural, democratic or less democratic systems, which themselves have a history, which themselves have biases and discrepancies built within them. And technology comes along to function within those mechanisms. It benefits from those mechanisms, and we see this perpetuated again and again. We could pick any technology that is being promised to offer us, the people, some kind of grand, neutral, flat playing field from which we can all benefit. Today I was talking to my students about blockchain technologies. And Bitcoin is built on top of that, but there's many other things. Blockchain being promised as a technology which can offer us transparency, which can offer us ways to create communities and connections between people that can be followed back to the source, that cannot be corrupted and so forth. But if you look at the companies that are benefiting from blockchain technology, if you see the top 20 people who have become rich off Bitcoin, they happen to be white, they happen to be based in the West, they happen to have built their riches on other technologies before they invested in Bitcoin, and now they have an investment in Bitcoin. This is this constant mechanism of power cycles through technologies. So yeah, that's my long-winded answer.
Okay, questions?
Yes.
Okay, there's one at the back. We're going to pass the microphone up.
It's okay, I can yell.
It's probably better for the recording if you can wait. Can I just see? Are there any more questions around that side? Go on, just at the back with the stripy.
Thank you for running.
I'll just see if there are any more questions.
Okay, so if you think that technology like shows and kind of works with like an undemocratic system already, doesn't it like neutrally show that undemocratic system?
Could you just open that up a little bit?
Okay, so if like white men rule the world and technology shows that white men rule the world, isn't that just like neutrally showing the facts?
The neutral part is the complicated part there. I mean, we can all agree on these things, and there's a lot of assumptions made in the way I present this. I come into this room expecting my audience to be left-leaning to some degree. I'm coming to this room expecting you to be educated to some degree, expecting you to be plugged into social media to a degree which I understand because I have something in common with you, and we have that commonality here amongst us. Yeah. So there is only neutrality in so much as we here have a shared point of departure to think about these things. But I would not say that neutrality is neutral across the board. Not just Elon Musk, but these figures that I didn't have time to talk about, the Richard Dawkins, the Jack Dorseys, the Jordan Petersons, they have enormous following on social media online, enormous. And these kind of very simplistic, equivocal statements that they make, they answer people's narrative coherencies. They answer the questions that people want about looking for narratives. We could pick any of these men and spend time thinking about where their power lies. Elon Musk is now the poster boy for some new future that we can all access through these incredible technologies. It's going to revolutionize infrastructure, completely overturn the way that we do everything, and we'll all be on Mars with him if only we can follow this. We can ridicule that, but I don't think necessarily everybody does, and these narratives are incredibly strong and self-perpetuating. This is maybe part of what I'm trying to piece out here. Does that make sense? Yeah?
So following up this dilemma about if we are the ones who are controlling the social media and things that are occurring in the internet, or we are being manipulated by that entity, white man, whoever that is. So you said something about altering these algorithms, and I was wondering if you actually thought about how we can alter these algorithms, or are we actually altering them as we speak, or what's up with that? Like, if you could develop more of that idea.
And yeah, this is my failing, that in 2015 I had this naive notion that if only we could grapple hold of the grand narrative that as a society we could agree on, that we could then start to manipulate and alter and change these algorithms to fit into that. I think that actually did happen, but it didn't happen in necessarily a democratic way. It happened by the likes of Donald Trump having enough money in his campaign to pay companies such as Cambridge Analytica, who knew what they were doing, to invest in advertising in the right spots and actually starting to manipulate these narratives and manipulate these algorithms. And
you could have been the President of the United States.
I could have been the President of the United States. This is my failing. But all I did is point to something in 2015 which was in the air, this narrative science claim, this claim of humanizing the data. People were already becoming aware at a corporate level that there was enormous power to be had in this big aggregate of data. If only companies could come along and start to pay attention to the narrative side of it, there was money to be made. Yeah, and that's what has taken place over this time. Now, to go back to your question, like, can we alter these conditions in some way? Can we intervene on them? Can we act? That's a really huge question that I think is the same kind of question that we ask ourselves about anything political. Can we mobilize? That's the real question. Can we come together as groups and come up with ideas and do that perhaps outside these systems that we are trying to push against? Now we will mobilize and we'll use the Facebook group to do it, which is quite a strange contradiction. So that it's the same questions that have always been asked, I think. But if we all today went onto Facebook and, I don't know, like something we didn't like, or something like this, I don't know, we could maybe have a small effect. But if we want to change how these algorithms function, we need to become programmers, we need to get into policy, we need to make the ethics of how these systems function part of how we act on the world out there and take it seriously. So it's a long process and it's pervasive. But yeah, we will have an impact on these things, but it's not going to be a pitchforks at dawn kind of impact on these things, if that makes sense. Any other questions?
Okay, Rachel, just beside you, there's somebody who wants to ask something. We make our way down and then across.
Hello. So in the quote by Wendy Chen you put up, you wrote code as law as police, or she wrote code as law as police. And the examples you gave, especially with the technologists, are big figureheads of corporations. who might not, at the end of the day, even touch a single keyboard in implementing their technologies. How much do you believe that the actual coders or the actual developers have any sort of agency in affecting the way that these technologies are built to reiterate these sort of ideas around that you were talking about in your talk?
It's a great question. And I think, again, it's... Of course, all of the programmers are individuals, and their individual biases and so forth are at play, but they are working within the mechanism of corporate America or wherever these things take place. And capitalism, techno-capitalism, has bound within it certain principles to maximize profits, to benefit the shareholders, to get more links and get more clicks from users, to have users feel that they invest in the platform and so forth. So the people have to have, the programmers have multiple things pressing on them. They have the figureheads of their companies who say things in the media and who have a vision to drive the company. They have the mechanisms of capital, the mechanisms of profit, the mechanisms of the marketplace that they are ensconced in, whether they like it or not. It's difficult to escape. They want to have jobs and pay their wages. And then they also have we, the users, and what we do and how we react. They want to please users. You'll not find an evil programmer that works for Facebook. There's no such thing. Many of them are great people who truly believe that Facebook is a system for bringing people together and bypassing certain hierarchies and so forth. So I'm sorry for fragmenting the question and distributing it again, but I think that's maybe part of Wendy Chun's point, that all of these different layers of complexity are part of this conversation. Maybe the strongest ones within that, for me anyway, are still capitalism, still techno-capital and how it works to drive profits. It's beneficial for Facebook that users stay on the site. And my paper in 2015 was saying that therefore it's better to have users see things that they like and bring them back. And so therefore it's better that that bubble does exist, that it does drive users to kind of enter into an echo chamber of their own likes and to have that conversation. To try and pop that bubble is an incredibly powerful thing, because we would have to at some level be grappling with the very way that capitalism functions, to maximize profits, to continue the business growing and so forth. And that's very fundamental at this stage. I mean, this has probably been said 8 million times in this week alone in this room, but there's that Frederick Jameson thing that it's much easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. This is yeah, see?
It's only Monday, and it's already...
It's only Monday.
8 million
but
times.
This is the cliche of our times. I've heard this in this room at least 10 times before, but it's a good soundbite, I think.
All right, there's a question down here. Okay, there's a question, this person here. And then there was one. Okay, we'll take this one and then two more.
Hi.
Thank you for talking to us tonight. I wanted to ask you if you...
Could you just go a bit closer then?
A bit closer like that?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you if you think that the rise of social media over the past 10 years has increased this notion of equivocality and the number of equivocal statements, or is it that it has made them more visible and problematic? Because maybe people have always spoken this way, but it's less filtered because of social media.
Yeah, I mean, Homi, Bhabha, and others are trying to make the claim that equivocation is essentially fundamental to how colonialist power functions. That in some sense, colonizing as an act has always been engaged with equivocal acts. to arrive in a country that has a different religion and to hold your Bible in front of the people and say, this is the rule of law, this is the new law of the land. You give the people education to help them read. You read the Bible, they become Christian, and then through the rule of law that you have ensconced into their lives, then you begin to lay control over those people. This is an equivocal act. Yeah. So just to as a foundation, has social media created more of these? I'm not sure. On a personal one-to-one level of individual speaking, possibly not. But as the site within which these imperialistic acts are now taking place, then yes. This is now the site and the space within which these power mechanisms function. And Donald Trump is the incredible, perfect example of this. He doesn't need the Bible to lay his power structure over a people. He has social media, of which he is now in some sense a kind of figurehead of this. Yeah, he speaks these statements to the narrative truths that he wishes to lay out into the world, and then the media laps them up, and then the media writes many statements about it, and then the people read those, and then they begin to believe them, and then the truth becomes this vibrant Donald Trumpian the hall of mirrors that we're all running through. Yeah. So maybe that's my answer. This is the site of power now, imperializing power.
All right. So there's two. Is that a question? Oh, okay. There's two questions there right next to each other, and then one at the back. You go first because you got the mic.
Sure. So I was reading a paper by one of my former professors recently. He's a scholar in Russia, and he was talking about this conversation about postmodernism and kind of this idea of Putin and Trump being postmodernist figures, and kind of clarifying that they're more like products or symptoms of postmodernism and not like agents per se. And so when you're talking about the duality of language and kind of contextualizing this with like how postmodernism is in a lot of ways about different subjectivities, I was wondering if you can maybe respond to that, or just curious how your thoughts tie into kind of that. Because he was talking about within art and literature, the intentionality is different with postmodernism, and the intentionality now is different.
Yeah, I mean, Jesus, do I want to go into the postmodernism thing? Maybe. I mean, to incredibly simplify, there were grand narratives in the modernist period. Jean-François Lyotard argues that they're fragmenting now, and that everybody can build their own in some sense. And maybe then, yeah, as you say, Donald Trump and Putin are a result of that. Yeah, maybe that works, and I need to read your friend's paper. But I would say that we have made a return to the grand narrative, and maybe it's a kind of hybrid of the two in some sense. Maybe this is why they are the perfect postmodern figures. It's interesting that Donald Trump has so much time for Putin and very much what's the word, that's more than one word, but yeah, he has a reverence for the guy. He respects him. Yeah,
he's on his knees praying.
He's on his knees praying for him. I think that Putin is far more canny and far more intentional in the things that he does. And I have no direct proof of this, but there's lots of evidence to show that Putin was seeding counter strategies in Russia. he would fund a human rights protest, and he would also send in the militia to hit them over the head in the streets, and you can find evidence of this. He's sowing seeds of confusion within his politics, so you can never quite pin him down. This is a very strange, seemingly postmodern strategy, but in the way that it rolls out, I think it creates the grand narrative, which is Putin is God, and we have to just listen to what he says, everything's going to be cool. He's got it in the best interest. Yeah.
Can I just use my...
Yeah.
Maybe not God, but certainly a force of order, or control, or something of a chaotic field, which is clearly now around sort of more globally. Around the postmodernism in Russia, you could look at Surkov and also Dugin, Alexander Dugin, who's kind of, if you were here last year, Mezzohaven showed a long clip of Dugin during their talk, and they're both explicitly postmodern thinkers who have come from, Surkov has come from the art field, and they kind of implement the strategies of postmodernism and interpretive rituals of art in the political space. So that would be a way to kind of make it more explicit.
Thank you.
I'd like to go back to the distinction we made between dataists and post-truthers. It occurs to me that they were, in a simple way, actually the same thing, in that they think of truth as the same thing as success in a quantifiable way. You know, whatever gets the most clicks or the most attention is, in a kind of crude evolutionary way, the winner, and that it might be just a simple function of money or capitalism's effect on various things. And so what I wanted to ask is it too simple to say that this is just the same thing going on, money's effect on communication, as has always gone on, money's effect on the media through the 20th century in driving more simplification or appeal to instincts that will get them more readers, the same effect as money's effect on entertainment in, say, simplifying or appealing to macho instincts or appealing to various things, and that has kind of accumulated or mutated over the 20th century and the 21st century. Do you think that social media is a different case quantitatively or just qualitatively or just quantitatively?
I mean, I would say, I think Suhal covered this a little bit at the very beginning, that although there's a lot of similarities and it's a continuum, we can see the connections. I mean, social media is built on the principles of capital. Google is a company that is making lots of money out of data. I do think that one of the things which is different is is a certain promise of the individual's connection to that information and that data. You have direct access to not just the celebrity that you can go and bitch about on social media, but also you are the data node within this larger system of which we are critiquing or which we are a part. So I'm not entirely sure, because sovereignty is a long promise that is offered in various conditions, but data sovereignty, it seems to be the kind of contemporary equivalent of that. Does that kind of answer your question? Okay.
Do you want to ask a question? Do you have one as well? Okay, so we've got two more. If you can make them quite brief.
Yeah, sure. Just because we're in this unknown future, I was just kind of thinking about if we're sitting in a difficult space by avoiding information. I think the artist's room, like most people have a different email address that they use or whatever, to try and get into like the cloud or whatever that is. Do you think that's kind of a do you think we're getting into a difficult space because people are doing that? Is my question.
So you're saying that we are entering a difficult space because people have multiple emails and they, I don't know, is that to kind of keep some kind of security so your identity is not tied to systems that you're using online or privacy or?
Yeah, if the algorithm has a bit of variation on either side and people are giving fake information.
You think that creates problems? In what sense? Could you give what kind of problem?
More like in kind of data collection.
It's not tied to your identity, is it?
Because you're breaking with this idea of the data node and distributing things a little bit. I think it probably in the sea of things that are happening, it has very little impact at all. These could be counter strategies, and I'm not saying for a second that you shouldn't be aware of the security of your information and be responsible for that and you know, encrypt your data and so forth. But all of these other mechanisms of getting your own sovereignty over your information again, they also become ensconced back into the system of capital there. You know, WhatsApp is sold as the encrypted space. So use this because we can't read what you're reading. But they can still feed advertisements to you on there and so forth and sell your data. So these counter strategies often get recuperated. That's maybe what I'm saying.
Okay. One last question.
I'm sorry if this comes out a bit garbled, but when you're talking about these grand narratives, it seems to me like really resonant with this understanding of like fascism, and like it has all of the same traits as fascism in the sense that it's just reducing something to a very easily digestible worldview. And then when we go back to the question of like what is to be done in terms of like how do we reverse some of these processes, like it feels like what these grand narratives are doing are almost giving people an object to like wade their way through the entropy of like data that they can't possibly deal with and orient themselves in the world without. So I guess the question is like to what extent do we need to change fundamentally like what it means to be a person in order to be able to kind of overcome that, or to posit not like a neutral subject, but like or like a pre Facebook or pre social media subject, but instead like I don't know. Sorry, that wasn't a short question.
It was short, but it's quite a large question.
No, I think it's good, and fascism. That's another big term that we don't have time to go into. But I definitely think that the promises that people like Trump make towards kind of simple narratives that can guide people through this complex time. That's one part of the kind of fascist outcome of this. How we respond, and I don't know I can't remember how you put it, but you said change ourselves, change how we are as human beings. I mean,
not really like understand the solution as being something like what we were before all of this social media stuff happened, but rather like kind of going all the way through like in kind of an accelerationist way. There is some accelerationist things going on there, maybe. I mean, I would say that I'm really interested in abundance, in more, and in grappling hold of that from a point of view of diversity. And I'm going to be completely rambling in general here, but to invest in the manufacture of incredibly diverse subjectivities, and to invest in those, and not necessarily invest in the liberal, I don't know, sovereign subject that has been so much a part of Western ideology since way back when. We can go back to Freud, we can go back to whatever, and through Capital and so forth. We are bound to these social media spaces, and we project ourselves, and we argue our points, and we argue against other points, and we hold our ground, and we affirm our identity politics, and we rile against those who push against it. Maybe we should be just
like casting off the one person that we are and trying to manufacture many others. That would be my strange, weird science fictional answer. And if I'd ever had time and I wasn't so rambling in all of the stuff I showed you, maybe I'd have talked about my art project as somehow engaged in the manufacture of identities, the proliferation of micro-narratives. Rather than grand narratives, we need as many narratives as possible, and a way to allow them to propagate, and a way to invest in them, and allow everybody's narratives to be important in some way. This is my grand utopian claim at the end of a lecture, trying to undermine utopian claims.
That's machine.net.
I know, additivism.
Additivist Manifesto. I'm not going to ask the question, but I just wanted to point out that equivocation, which is the refusal to commit to a single meaning, has of course been the fundamental tenet of contemporary art. That is what every contemporary artwork does. So you then have a circuit between the standard critical claims of contemporary art, precisely the power structures that you're saying are being imposed through these kinds of mechanisms. Maybe that's something that we can think about in the coming weeks. So don't forget the register, bring it here to sign. Don't forget the seminar on Wednesday at 12:30 with Sophie if you want to follow up on some of this discussion. And don't forget that there's a bar outside where we can talk about fascism. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for your question.